October 22, 1962, 7:17 p.m., the television hummed in the corner of a dim living room in Cleveland, Ohio. The screen flickered black and white, casting nervous shadows across the wallpaper. Thomas Adler sat forward on the couch, elbows on his knees, fingers locked together so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. He could smell cigarette smoke, his own, and something else underneath it, the sharp, metallic scent of fear. When President Kennedy's voice cut through the static, the room seemed to shrink. Unmistakable evidence that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. Thomas didn't fully understand missiles. He didn't need to. What he understood was the silence that followed those words. His wife, Eleanor, stopped folding laundry. Their 8-year-old son, Michael, looked up from the floor, sensing the shift without knowing why. Somewhere outside, a car passed, ordinary and oblivious, and the normalcy of that sound felt almost offensive. This was the moment fear stopped being an emotion and became an environment. For months, years, really, Thomas had lived with a background tension he couldn't name. A low-grade pressure behind the eyes. A habit of scanning the sky when planes passed overhead. He read the newspaper every morning, not for sports or business, but for the subtext, what weren't they saying today? The Cold War had taught him that danger didn't announce itself. It waited. Quiet. Patient. Now, sitting in that living room, the waiting felt over. Kennedy spoke of quarantine, of resolve, of sacrifice. Thomas heard something else entirely. There may not be a future to plan for. His mind raced ahead without permission. Eleanor's face, Michael's school, the unfinished fence in the backyard. All of it suddenly fragile, provisional, as if life itself had become a temporary arrangement. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the house settle, every creak sounding like a distant explosion. Eleanor breathed beside him, shallow and uneven. At 2:03 a.m., he got up and stood at the window, staring at a sky that looked no different than it had the night before. That was the most unsettling part. The world didn't look like it was ending. It looked calm. And that calm was the lie the Cold War perfected. In the weeks that followed, nothing happened, and everything changed. The missiles didn't launch. The cities didn't burn. Life continued. But something inside Thomas quietly rewired itself. Fear, once sharp and episodic, flattened into a constant hum. The mind adapted the way it always does, not by eliminating the threat, but by learning how to carry it. At work, he noticed it in small behaviors. Conversations stopped when supervisors walked by. Jokes became darker, more fatalistic. Someone taped a fallout shelter diagram inside a locker, half as humor, half as instruction. No one laughed very hard. You learned quickly which thoughts to voice and which to swallow. At home, Eleanor began stockpiling canned food without saying why. Michael started practicing duck and cover drills at school, coming home with casual explanations that chilled Thomas more than panic ever could. If the flash comes, his son said once, you're supposed to hide your eyes. Thomas nodded, pretending this made sense. This was how the training worked, not through dramatic announcements, but repetition. Through routines. Through institutions that spoke in calm, authoritative tones while describing the end of the world as a logistical problem. Fear wasn't screamed. It was normalized. Over time, Thomas stopped asking if something would happen and started adjusting to when. His thoughts narrowed. Long-term dreams felt irresponsible. Why plan 10 years ahead when tomorrow was uncertain? He worked harder, obeyed rules more strictly, avoided conflict. Stability became a moral virtue. Questioning felt dangerous. And without realizing it, he began policing himself. This was the quiet victory of the Cold War, not dominance through force, but through psychology. The mind learned to accept constant threat as the price of safety. Anxiety became patriotic. Obedience became rational. Emotional restraint wasn't just encouraged, it was necessary. You can feel it, even now, if you imagine standing where Thomas stood. The way fear presses you inward. The way it teaches you to lower your expectations, to call numbness strength. The way it convinces you that adaptation is the same as control. By the end of 1962, Thomas could function again. He laughed at dinners. He fixed the fence. He went to work every morning. On the surface, nothing was wrong. But beneath it all, a new rule governed his inner life: stay alert. Stay quiet. Stay ready. The Cold War didn't need to scare him anymore. It had already taught his mind how to do that on its own. January 10, 1963, 6:45 a.m. Thomas trudged down the snowy sidewalk toward his office in downtown Cleveland. The air was sharp enough to sting his lungs, and he kept his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. On the corner, a small group of neighbors huddled around a radio, listening intently to a government broadcast about civil defense procedures. Thomas didn't join them. He already knew every instruction by heart, but he paused just long enough to hear the words echo through the frozen morning. In the event of a nuclear strike, follow these steps precisely. Your survival depends on your preparedness. The repetition of drills, instructions, and public service announcements had become a subtle, unrelenting teacher. Children at school practiced duck-and-cover maneuvers. Workplaces posted evacuation routes. Public buildings displayed fallout shelter signs like quiet sentinels of an invisible war. No one panicked. No one even discussed fear openly. The lessons were absorbed quietly like air in the lungs, shaping behavior without acknowledgement. At his office, Thomas noticed his own hands tapping a rhythm on the desktop, a nervous habit he hadn't realized he'd adopted. He wasn't aware that the drills had already penetrated his daily life. When a fire alarm rang for a routine test, his chest tightened automatically. He didn't need to be told, it was a signal, a code ingrained by months of repetition. The invisible drill extended beyond physical reactions. Conversations at the water cooler, once casual, now carried a tone of caution. Colleagues discussed what-ifs quietly, their voices low and precise. No one needed to remind each other about the threat. It was understood, omnipresent, and internalized. Thomas found himself thinking ahead in survival scenarios. Where he would hide, which roads were safest, how long it would take to reach the nearest shelter. Logical planning had merged seamlessly with fear. Even Eleanor was part of this silent conditioning. She had begun labeling cupboards with food rotation dates and quietly inspecting the basement for leaks. Thomas watched her, feeling both admiration and an unspoken tension. Her calm vigilance reinforced his own sense of preparedness, creating a shared, unspoken pact of survival. In this way, the Cold War shaped families from the inside, quietly orchestrating behavior with invisible strings. The most unsettling realization came during a casual conversation with Michael. The boy had memorized instructions for handling a nuclear event, reciting them almost cheerfully: duck, cover, wait for the all-clear signal. Thomas forced a smile but felt a chill creep along his spine. His child, not yet 10, carried a procedural understanding of death that he himself had only learned through decades of anxiety and media. The conditioning had crossed generational boundaries, embedding itself in thought, habit, and instinct. By mid-morning, Thomas found himself reflecting on the subtle mastery the Cold War exerted over his mind. Fear was no longer an emergency reaction. It had become a lens through which he interpreted the world. Ordinary events, like traffic jams or a delayed mail delivery, could trigger that latent tension, the same physiological tightness that had defined the missile crisis months earlier. The drills had transformed him into a vigilant observer of his environment, a self-trained sentry of an invisible battlefield. And yet, paradoxically, he felt a strange comfort in this constant readiness. There was clarity in procedure, in the rules for survival, in the unspoken structure that dictated daily life. Anxiety had been harnessed, trained, and repurposed into a form of disciplined awareness. The mind, like muscle memory, had internalized danger as routine. This was the Cold War's quiet triumph, shaping consciousness, behavior, and emotion without violence, without confrontation, and without overt instruction. People didn't notice the teaching, they lived it. Thomas had become both student and subject, unknowingly participating in an endless, invisible drill designed to control not only actions but thoughts. March 5, 1964, 11:22 p.m., Thomas sat alone at his kitchen table, the dim yellow light reflecting off his coffee mug. Outside, the wind rattled the window frames, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded like a warning. He ran his hands through his hair, a subtle tremor betraying the calm mask he wore around Eleanor and Michael. He wasn't in immediate danger, no missiles were incoming, no alarms blared, but his mind raced with what-ifs he couldn't silence. It had begun subtly. At first, he noticed it in the way he scrutinized strangers on the street. A man glancing over his shoulder triggered a flicker of unease. A sudden knock at the door made him pause mid-step. Letters from the government, innocuous notices about taxes or census reports, were sometimes read twice, carefully as if hidden codes might appear. The drills, the public warnings, the constant media reminders, they had done more than instruct survival. They had implanted vigilance, a form of paranoia that felt necessary, rational even. At work, he noticed similar patterns among colleagues. Meetings began with forced smiles but ended with silent calculations of trust. Rumors, half-truths about spies, defectors, or leaks, circulated and were absorbed with gravity. No one laughed at them. Curiosity mingled with suspicion, and everyone became both observer and suspect in a subtle mental game. Thomas realized he had internalized this logic. Safety wasn't just about following rules, it was about predicting human behavior, reading intent, and controlling perception. At home, Eleanor sensed the tension, though she never called it fear. She adjusted routines, stockpiled essentials, and encouraged Michael to practice drills, but she never revealed her own anxiety. The household ran like a quiet command center, each member fulfilling roles dictated by invisible forces. Thomas wondered, not for the first time, whether this state of constant readiness was survival, or whether the very act of being ready had become a trap, a cage of his own making. And yet, this paranoia offered power. In moments of uncertainty, Thomas felt a clarity others lacked. He could anticipate disruptions, plan contingencies, and navigate risk in ways that made him appear calm, collected, and competent. His mind had learned to exploit fear as a tool, turning anxiety into strategy. But the cost was subtle. Intimacy, spontaneity, the ability to relax. Every action was filtered through layers of anticipation, every interaction measured, every word weighed. On one particular night, he caught himself staring at Michael as the boy slept. The child's brow was furrowed slightly, as if dreams themselves were rehearsals for disaster. Thomas's chest tightened. He realized the Cold War hadn't just conditioned adults, it had reshaped childhood itself. Fear was now hereditary, a psychological inheritance passed silently through observation, modeling, and practice. He felt both the weight of responsibility and the sting of helplessness. Thomas began to notice that this state of hypervigilance had changed his perception of reality. Ordinary uncertainty, a delayed train, a missing letter, a friend running late, now felt like a potential threat. Anxiety had become the lens through which he filtered every experience. And yet, paradoxically, it also sharpened him. Every decision was informed, every movement considered, every outcome mapped in advance. Survival had become an internalized reflex, a habit of the mind that demanded constant attention. He sipped his coffee and let the silence settle. The Cold War had done its work not through weapons, not through politics, but through subtle psychological engineering. Thomas understood now, the real battlefield wasn't cities or borders. It was the human mind. Fear had been taught, repeated, normalized, and he had learned it too well. July 18, 1965, 5:03 a.m., Thomas awoke to the faint hum of the air conditioner in the bedroom. The room was still dark, the faint light of dawn struggling through the blinds. He lay there for several minutes, listening to the steady breathing of Eleanor beside him, feeling the familiar tug of unease coil in his chest. It was a ritual by now, the quiet moment before the day began, when the mind ran its simulations, rehearsing potential disasters before the world had even woken up. He dressed slowly, each motion deliberate, as if by acting carefully he could stave off invisible threats. Breakfast was a precise operation. Toast browned to perfection, eggs cooked just enough, milk poured with a steady hand. Eleanor glanced at him, smiling faintly, sensing his mind already racing ahead. Michael, still sleepy, moved like a shadow, reciting parts of the duck-and-cover drills from the night before. The family had learned a rhythm, a disciplined choreography born from fear but framed as care. Thomas walked to the kitchen window and looked out over the quiet street. Everything seemed normal. Mail trucks trundled along their usual routes, neighbors shuffled to work, but his mind overlaid a subtle map of danger on top of the mundane. He imagined scenarios: planes overhead, accidents in the streets, whispers of spies among the community. Each thought was accompanied by a measure of preparedness: which way to run, what supplies to grab, how to protect the ones he loved. This mental discipline extended beyond reaction. It became identity. Thomas realized that fear had trained him to notice patterns, anticipate problems, and respond swiftly. He had become a master of contingencies, a silent sentinel in a world where threats were invisible. But the cost was hidden in plain sight. Moments of relaxation were brief, laughter tempered, and spontaneous joy often deferred. The mind that had learned to survive so efficiently had forgotten how to simply live. Evenings brought reflection, a different kind of exercise. Thomas would sit alone after Michael had gone to bed and Eleanor had settled with her book. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock, and he allowed himself the rare indulgence of thought without immediate action. That was when he noticed the transformation most clearly. Fear had become second nature. It guided decisions, framed interactions, and silently dictated priorities. He was alert in ways that others were not, yet tethered to a constant low-grade tension that he could neither name nor release. And yet, there was subtle power in this conditioning. Thomas could navigate uncertainty with calm precision. He knew when to act, when to hold back, when to speak, and when to remain silent. Fear had given him structure, resilience, and focus. The Cold War had not only threatened him, it had taught him to master the subtle art of psychological survival. He watched Michael drawing at the kitchen table, small hands moving carefully across the page. The child's world was framed by instruction, ritual, and silent vigilance, but there was curiosity there too, a spark untouched by fear. Thomas felt a pang of hope. Perhaps some part of the mind could learn not only to survive but also to grow, even under the shadow of constant tension. As the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a warm glow across the kitchen, Thomas took a deep breath and realized something profound. The mind, once shaped by fear, could also learn balance. Preparation could coexist with care. Vigilance could coexist with trust. He didn't need to abandon the lessons of the past, but he could choose which ones to carry forward, and which ones to leave behind. October 1, 1967, 8:42 p.m., Thomas sat on the worn bench in the small park near his apartment. The air smelled of damp leaves and early autumn smoke. A breeze stirred, and for a moment, he felt something he hadn't in years, a strange looseness in his chest as if a weight had been lifted slightly. He watched children run freely across the grass, their laughter ringing unpolished but pure. It struck him how different their world was from the one he carried in his mind, a world layered with constant drills, invisible threats, and a discipline born from fear. He thought back to the missile crises, the endless alerts, the drills at school and work. All of it had shaped him, trained him, sharpened his senses. And yet, it had also clipped something delicate, the ability to simply exist without scanning for danger. That evening, Thomas allowed himself to step back from the constant calculations. He didn't analyze the children's movements or anticipate every possible hazard. He didn't rehearse contingencies in his mind. He just watched. The process was gradual, almost imperceptible. In small choices, pausing before speaking, lingering over a warm cup of tea, letting Michael tell a story without correcting him, he began testing the boundaries of the fear-conditioned mind. Each moment of quiet reflection became a micro-rebellion, a subtle reclaiming of thought and attention. He noticed the mind's natural habit of leaping toward worst-case scenarios and learned to hold it gently without letting it dominate. Eleanor noticed it too. At dinner that night, she commented on his relaxed posture, the absence of tension in his hands as he passed the salt. He smiled faintly, realizing that his internal discipline didn't need to manifest as constant rigidity. The habits of vigilance could coexist with moments of peace if he consciously allowed them to. It was not an instant transformation. He could still feel the hum of anxiety under ordinary pressures. But it was a start, a first step in redefining how he related to fear. Thomas began applying this subtle mastery beyond the home. At work, he allowed small uncertainties to exist without immediate reaction. Meetings flowed with less tension. Conversations with colleagues felt lighter, less mechanical. And though the underlying drills of Cold War conditioning still whispered in the back of his mind, he discovered he could acknowledge them without surrendering to them. The mind, he realized, could be guided not just by fear but by choice. That evening, before bed, Thomas reflected on the lessons of the past decade. The Cold War had trained him with relentless rigor. It had forced him to observe, anticipate, and survive. But he now understood something critical. The same mind that could be sharpened by fear could also be retrained through conscious reflection. Emotional control, self-awareness, and deliberate choice were tools as powerful as vigilance itself. As he lay beside Eleanor, listening to Michael's soft breathing from the next room, Thomas felt a fragile sense of liberation. He hadn't abandoned preparedness, nor had he erased the lessons of fear, but he had begun the work of reclaiming his inner life. The Cold War had shaped him, but it would not define the boundaries of his mind forever. April 14, 1970, 9:15 a.m., Thomas sat by the window in his study, sunlight spilling over the spines of neatly arranged books. Outside, the city stirred with its usual rhythm, cars, pedestrians, and the faint murmur of distant construction. For the first time in years, he noticed it all without his chest tightening, without his mind racing through threats and contingencies. The constant hum of fear had quieted, replaced by something unfamiliar: choice. He reflected on the invisible lessons of the past decade. The drills, the alerts, the carefully repeated instructions from government broadcasts, all of it had conditioned his responses. But now Thomas realized he could consciously step into those thoughts, observe them, and decide which ones to follow and which to set aside. Fear no longer commanded him, it informed him. Anxiety could be a signal, not a master. The process was painstaking. Some mornings, his mind reverted to old habits: scanning, planning, calculating worst-case scenarios. Yet with practice, he learned to notice these impulses without letting them dictate action. He began small, delaying reactions, questioning assumptions, allowing uncertainty to exist without immediate resolution. Each tiny act of mental restraint became a building block in reclaiming his autonomy. At work, Thomas experimented with this new approach. Meetings that once felt like minefields now became exercises in observation rather than anticipation. He listened more, assumed less, and allowed dialogue to flow naturally. His colleagues noticed the change. He seemed calmer, more present. What had once been a hypervigilant survival mechanism transformed into a quiet authority, rooted in clarity rather than fear. At home, Thomas applied the same principle. He no longer rehearsed Michael's drills in his mind or inspected Eleanor's preparations with silent tension. Instead, he allowed space for improvisation, creativity, and shared decision-making. Family life felt lighter, not because the threat had disappeared, but because the mind that had been trained to anticipate disaster now understood it could also choose peace. One evening, as he watched Michael play with a new set of toy blocks, Thomas felt a profound sense of perspective. The child's imagination, unconstrained by fear, reminded him of what had been lost, and what could be regained. He realized that mastery over the mind didn't mean eliminating anxiety entirely, it meant reclaiming authority over thought, deciding when to let fear guide action and when to simply observe. Thomas began keeping a journal, recording moments when he noticed old patterns of vigilance and how he redirected them. The act of writing itself became a ritual of mental reclamation, a way to reinforce control over his thoughts. He saw clearly that the Cold War had left an indelible mark, but the mind was not a passive vessel. It could adapt, heal, and evolve. By the end of that spring morning, Thomas understood something essential. The mind that had been trained by fear could also be trained by awareness, reflection, and choice. Emotional mastery was possible, not through denial of the past, but through active engagement with it. Survival had taught him vigilance. Now life would teach him balance. September 3, 1973, 6:30 p.m., Thomas walked slowly along the riverfront, the golden light of sunset reflecting off the water in streaks of orange and pink. He paused, letting the cool breeze brush against his face, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of presence unshackled from constant anticipation. The Cold War, with all its drills, alerts, and invisible pressures, had receded from the center of his mind. It lingered like a shadow at the edge of awareness, but it no longer dictated every thought. The transformation had been gradual. Vigilance, once an automatic reaction, had become a tool rather than a trap. Thomas now recognized the difference between threat and rumination, between preparation and obsession. He could step back, evaluate situations with clarity, and allow uncertainty to exist without panic. Each deliberate breath, each mindful pause, was a small act of reclaiming his mental landscape. At home, the change was visible. Family dinners felt lighter. Laughter returned with less restraint. Michael's questions no longer triggered instant mental simulations of danger. Eleanor noticed the shift too, a subtle relaxation in his posture, a willingness to embrace unpredictability. Together, they were beginning to reclaim the joy that constant fear had eroded. Even at work, Thomas noticed a new rhythm. The hyper-alert vigilance that had once defined him was replaced by calm focus. Meetings flowed more naturally. Decisions were made without the gnawing anxiety that had once accompanied every choice. The mind that had learned to survive under constant threat now applied that same sharpness to life rather than to imagined disaster. He reflected on the lessons of the past decade. Fear had been a teacher, but it had been a harsh one. It had instilled discipline, focus, and awareness, but it had also created rigidity, suspicion, and tension. The journey to balance required conscious effort, observing thoughts without being dominated by them, recognizing old conditioning, and practicing deliberate emotional regulation. As he continued his walk along the river, Thomas felt the satisfaction of a mind slowly untangling itself from its own conditioning. He could still acknowledge the Cold War's lessons, the drills, the preparation, the attention to detail, but they no longer controlled him. He had become both a student of fear and a master of his own mind. The world beyond the riverfront was ordinary, unremarkable, and yet, to Thomas, it shimmered with possibility. He realized that survival had been the first step, but living fully with awareness and balance was the true mastery. Fear could inform, guide, and prepare, but it no longer needed to dominate. Thomas stopped, closed his eyes, and inhaled deeply. The wind carried the faint scent of the river, a mix of earth and water, and for the first time in years, He allowed himself to simply exist. The drills, the alerts, the invisible pressures, they were part of his past, not the commander of his present. He had learned the most profound lesson the Cold War could teach. The mind, once trained by fear, could also be retrained by choice, reflection, and presence. Survival had shaped him, but balance had freed him. November 12, 1975, 8:50 a.m., Thomas stood in Michael's bedroom, watching his son pack a small backpack for a school field trip. The boy moved with energy and curiosity, completely unburdened by the undercurrents of anxiety that had once dominated Thomas's own childhood. For the first time, Thomas noticed the subtle ways the lessons of fear could be transformed into lessons of mindfulness, preparation, and resilience without panic. He remembered the constant drills, the silent tension, and the pervasive lessons of threat that had governed his formative years. The Cold War had taught vigilance, focus, and discipline, but it had also taught rigidity, suspicion, and self-restraint taken to extremes. Thomas understood now that awareness was the missing link, knowing when to heed fear and when to let it pass, observing thoughts without letting them control action. At work, he began mentoring younger colleagues not through lectures but by modeling this delicate balance. He encouraged calm observation, deliberate planning, and measured response. He showed them that survival skills weren't only for emergencies, they were also tools to navigate life with clarity and composure. Thomas had learned that mastery over the mind was not about suppressing fear, but about understanding it, guiding it, and using it purposefully. At home, his relationship with Eleanor deepened. The quiet tension that had once governed their household loosened, replaced by open conversation and shared decision-making. They discussed possibilities instead of threats, plans instead of contingencies. Michael, observing these subtle cues, learned that vigilance could coexist with creativity, responsibility could coexist with play, and that fear could inform rather than dominate. That evening, Thomas sat alone on the porch, a notebook in hand. He began writing not just events but reflections, how fear had shaped him, how discipline had preserved him, and how conscious choice had freed him. He realized that the most lasting lesson of the Cold War wasn't about bombs, missiles, or global strategy, it was about the human mind itself. The mind, Thomas understood, was a battlefield far more complex than any geopolitical map. Fear could shape behavior, mold perception, and direct action, but it could also be observed, understood, and transformed. Through deliberate reflection, emotional mastery, and conscious choice, he had reclaimed authority over his own thoughts. Looking at the sky, tinged with the fading hues of sunset, Thomas felt gratitude. The Cold War had been relentless, its lessons unyielding, yet it had also provided the raw material for resilience, focus, and mental mastery. The journey from fear to balance was neither quick nor easy, but it was real. And now, as he closed his notebook and inhaled the crisp evening air, Thomas felt a quiet certainty. The mind could be trained to survive, but it could also be trained to live fully.